Ladies and gentlemen, Club F welcomes Hilary Pearson.
Thank you all very much for staying and for listening. I know it's halfway through the afternoon, and that's always a killer time for any person who's speaking. So I hope you'll all be awake for the next half hour. And I'm probably not going to help things by starting with some numbers. Numbers put people to sleep right away, I know. But still, numbers also give you some grounding in what I'm going to be talking about, which is the Canadian Foundation landscape. And I'm very pleased that at least two of my members, Valerie, thank you, and Ian Beck spoke before me, because I think you've illustrated very well in your own individual ways and from your own perspectives the different ways in which Canadian foundations operate in our landscape. So I'll be giving you the very big picture. Now that you've heard from the individual foundations, you'll be getting the big picture from me. Let's see. Clicker, I did not pick up, Peter. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. Starting with the numbers, and again, I apologize. Some of this may be hard for you to see, and I think that the presentations are available to people.
Yeah, I hope. Sorry, we will be circulating them around for those speakers who let us.
So you don't have to take notes, unless you want to. This slide is really just intended to give you a sense of the overall landscape. This is information drawn from the Canada Revenue Agency. And let me mention right away, a caveat on the data. CRA is not actually a statistical agency, it's a regulator, and they don't really do any data checking. They compile data based on the annual returns from Canadian charities, and they don't actually verify a lot of that information. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. However, I think that they have been able to count properly. So we're pretty sure that as of 2016, there were 86,112 registered charities in this country, of which about 10,000 are foundations. So that just gives you an idea of foundations, 10%, 12% perhaps of the total number of charities in the country. And on the right-hand side, you see the assets and grants, which is probably hard for you to see. This information actually is also available on our website, but this gives you an idea of the split between private foundations and public foundations. And just so you know what that means, private foundations typically include family, independent, corporate foundations. So RBC, for example, is a private foundation. Public foundations, on the other hand, are ones that are not controlled by a single donor or whose funds don't come from a single source. So you see actually that there are, in terms of assets and grants in this slide, you'll see that private foundations have slightly more assets, but give fewer grants. And that's explained by the model of the private foundation. Largely, private foundations provide grants based on an endowment, and they're giving sort of 3.5% to 4% per year from that endowment, or from the returns in that endowment. Public foundations, I should also mention, are dominated by institutional and fundraising foundations. So that would be, for example, university foundations, it would be colleges, it would be the sorts of foundations that are usually attached to charities and that are raising money for them. And our membership in Philanthropic Foundations Canada, which is the network that I run, is primarily made up of private foundations, and those would be mostly family foundations. Not all. Very happy to have RBC with us. And it's important for us to create a big tent for philanthropy in Canada. So we have included public foundations from the beginning. But it's typically a private foundation that joins our network. Now, I'll take you to, unfortunately, another slide, but one that is, in terms of numbers, but one that is easy to read. So the blue line is private foundations, and the orange line is public foundations. And over the years, you see pretty steep growth in the number of private foundations. A perhaps more leveling or even downturning growth in the number of public foundations. Again, this is information that comes from the Canada Revenue Agency, which registers and counts these foundations. And I think what this is telling us is that this is an indicator of growth in overall giving by high net worth families in Canada. And I think it's a pretty strong growth. It's been mentioned earlier by some of the previous speakers. I will say, though, that of the 5,556, I think that is number of, or 566 number of private foundations, not all are active. Meaning some of them are on the books still at the Canada Revenue Agency, but they may not actually be granting. So it's a little tricky to, one can't extrapolate from this number and say, yes, there are 5,500 active private foundations in the country right now. But I do think that the overall growth number tells you that high net worth individuals are definitely choosing private foundations as vehicles for their giving. We tend to look at ourselves at the top 150 grant makers by assets as a more interesting lens through which to see the behavior of private foundations in Canada. It's a pyramid, and at the tip of that pyramid, you'll find a small number of large foundations. And so typically that top 150 will have the bulk of the grants, the bulk of the assets, and the bulk of the grants. So when we do our analytical work as an organization, trying to understand trends and patterns in foundation philanthropy, we're often looking at the top 150, not the 5,566. The next slide is, this is showing you assets and grants over time. And again, the blue line is public and the orange line is private foundations. And again, you see on the left-hand side assets, on the right-hand side grants. Assets typically larger in the private foundation community, grants smaller in dollar terms, but again, that's explained by the foundation model. Also, a little caveat for this data in Canada. We have one very large private foundation. So in the United States, you have Gates, and you have many other large foundations. Gates, admittedly, is still the behemoth of the foundation community. Here in Canada, we have the MasterCard Foundation. And it is so big that we are now looking at a $9 billion endowment for that foundation. Even in the United States, that would be a big foundation. But it dwarfs any other foundation on the private side in Canada. And that's causing some trouble for our numbers because it does distort so you'll actually see in the assets that growth there on the far right column in the orange assets. That would be partly the fact that over the last 2 years, the MasterCard Foundation has gone from something like $3 billion to $9 billion. Huge increase very quickly. So that's a caveat. However, once again, I think that even if you take out the MasterCard Foundation, this is telling you that there's a steady growth in high net worth giving through private foundations. So next, and only 2 more data slides, and then I'll start talking to you about some interesting things. This is the geographic distribution in Canada. Again, the orange and the green distinction. So orange is, as you can see, is private, just to confuse you there, and green is public. What you see, if you're looking particularly at private foundations, is a concentration of private foundations in Ontario and Quebec. And that's not surprising. This is just numeric, by the way, numbers of foundations. You would expect that because the wealth of the country historically has been in Ontario and Quebec. You're beginning to see that move west. So there's a significant group of private foundations in BC and in Alberta. It's interesting for me, running a network of foundations, that the most active foundations in terms of collaboration and visibility still are the ones in Ontario and Quebec. We haven't yet seen that happening in BC. Not sure why. There's a lot that we actually don't know about the behavior of family foundations or private foundations. But it's certainly true that the bulk of our membership, for example, reflects this distribution, and most of them are based in Ontario or Quebec. I should also mention, and this was mentioned earlier by Ian, I think, family foundations on the whole remain very thinly staffed in Canada. So a typical family foundation would be one in which you had maybe 1 or 2 professionals. They might actually be run by the family office, more likely they'd be run by the family office if they've come out of that sort of structure. And they don't invest much in their structures. Ian's absolutely right. It's a limitation, I think, on the scope of philanthropic activity in this country. It's not assets that are a brake on the impact of philanthropy. It's the people. It's the resources. It's everything that comes with having the right people in these jobs and the kind of focus and the interest and impact. But I think Ian tells you that you don't have to have a lot of people to have a huge amount of impact, nor a lot of assets to have a lot of impact. You do need to have focus, though. Funding by region is the next slide. Did I move it? There we go. So funding by region, again, is just an indication of the total grants by foundations, again, where they're concentrated. Foundations tend to give where they live. So 51% in Ontario, and that just tells you that 50% of our members come from Ontario, 51% of the granting goes into Ontario. It's a very active community here in this province. And finally, in terms of data slides, funding by issue. So this is taken from our snapshot, and perhaps I'll let you know at this point, and for anybody who really is a data maven, who really loves data, all of this is on our website. So we actually do what we call a snapshot of foundation giving. It's downloadable. And what we've done is we've looked at the top 150 grant makers by assets and by grants. So you can go and find this information, and we're doing it on a yearly basis. We're working closely with Imagine Canada, which is the umbrella for the charitable sector in Canada, which is helping us do the cleanup of the data that I mentioned earlier as a problem from the CRA database. We also have, and this is our snapshot from 2013, we have actually a full list of the top 150 in our appendices to these snapshots. So you can get the names of foundations if you're interested in looking at that. So what are foundations giving to? And these are very broad funding sectors. What the data is telling us is, and unfortunately, again, caveat on the data, we're understanding this from the grantees that people are identifying in the reports to the Canada Revenue Agency. So if you say that you've given to the University of Toronto, that then goes into education. It might not be a grant that you've given to the University of Toronto for education. And we don't have that level of data. Unfortunately, we don't have that analytical capacity. I wish we did, but we don't. So we have to look at this with some skepticism, particularly in education, because universities are very big recipients of grants from foundations in Canada, very big. But again, the purpose of the grant is unknown in most cases. So it could be for research, it could be for teaching quality, it could be for scholarships, it could be for building buildings at universities. We don't know. Unless we do a lot of digging, which perhaps will come. Anyway, all that being said, education, health, and social services tend to be the three top areas for giving year after year after year in Canada by foundations. And what that means is that those sectors are really good at getting grants from foundations. There are lots of big universities, there are lots of big hospitals, and they target foundations. And foundations find it easy to give to those grantees. So that's part of the reason why those three, as well as the fact that there is need. I will concede that there is need in these sectors. And so it is important for foundations to grant to them. The rest of them, as you see going down the list, end up with, I think the lowest number there is law, advocacy, and politics. Foundations don't like to be political, and they don't like to associate with advocacy. That's another whole topic that we could talk about maybe in the question period. I think personally that it's an important thing that foundations should fund, but it's not easy for foundations to do that. I won't spend more time on that now. I want to, in the interest of time, I'd like to move into a bit of a discussion around how I see things changing and sort of answering the question that you had, Peter. What are the trends? What are the implications for philanthropy in Canada and for foundations in particular? So this would be these four things that you see now, you would be seeing right across North America in the last 5 to 10 years. Definitely more infrastructure, by which we mean organizations like mine, organizations like funder affinity groups that have developed, more formal networks, and more advisors of all kinds, whether they're consultants or financial advisors or legal advisors. There are more people working in this field and supporting the development of organized philanthropy. There's definitely more exchange. So among these foundations, the greater number of foundations that we see, we also see more interest in actually learning about each other and actually exchanging information. And that's facilitated by the digital explosion, the fact that it's so easy, relatively speaking now, to communicate with each other by email and across large distances and very quickly. We all know the impact of digital in everything we do. Well, it's certainly affecting philanthropy as well. And I think the positive side is that it's increasing the amount of exchange going on. Transparency, that's a word that was mentioned earlier today. I do see more growth in certainly the communication by foundations about themselves, more websites. When I started this job, hardly anybody had a website. Well, actually, I won't tell you when I started the job, but because that might tell you why there weren't too many websites. But there certainly are more websites now, and that's a choice that foundations are making. There's more reporting, not just to the regulator, but also to each other and to grantees. Social media is forcing more transparency, in a way. I won't say that there's a whole lot more in Canada in traditional media around philanthropy and around foundations. Interesting. I find it's a huge gap. Nobody in the sort of traditional, if you want to call it traditional sort of journalism community, is all that interested in profiling philanthropy. Maybe they just think it's a good thing. And we haven't suffered from some of the visibility issues that Gates and others have encountered in the States. And I think our colleague who you'll be hearing from after me, Michael from Germany, we'll talk about some of the visibility problems that foundations in Europe have experienced. It's not all good to be transparent. Or if you are going to be transparent, be aware that it does bring risk as well as reward. And the last is impact. And again, you've heard all this already from the very good examples of people working right now in the field. The interest in understanding impact. More hard questions are being asked. And foundations do want to understand more about their own effectiveness. It's not just the same old hand out your grants until the money runs out, and that's that, end of the day. PinJam. This was coined by, at least in my hearing, it was coined by one of our former chairs, Tim Broadhead, who's a dean in the foundation community in Canada. He was the president of one of our larger family foundations. And he declared this at one of our conferences in a very forceful way and didn't explain what he meant. He said PinJam, and then he looked at everybody expectantly, and absolutely nobody had any idea what he was talking about. So he had to explain philanthropy is not just about money. But I think the key message that Tim was giving us was that the paradigm is changing. Foundations are not just simply about handing out the dollars. They are moving past the charitable bank model. And by the way, when I speak about this, I am probably talking still about the leading edge, the small number of foundations that are really being very thoughtful. And you've heard examples of Ian and Valerie. This would not be typical of that great large number of foundations that I mentioned earlier who tend not to be, there's no there's no staff, and there's no necessarily any thinking. But those who are thinking about their role, and they're thinking about moving from being a donor to being an investor of sorts, with everything that implies about returns and about what it is you're trying to understand and the measurement of what you're doing. So I think that more foundations are moving from the idea of deploying capital through grants, which, as people have said, are essentially just pre-forgiven loans, just give it away, or to grants plus program-related investments, plus impact investing. You mentioned this, Peter. There's a constellation of tools that people have to deploy capital philanthropically. and more foundations are thinking more broadly about how to use their tools. I think there's more thinking about the value add of foundations. So beyond money, what else have you got? Ian actually illustrated that very well. What else do you have to offer? You've got information to offer. You have connections to offer. You have ideas around policy change to offer. You have convening power to offer. Many opportunities to be a very effective player in the market of public good in ways that go well beyond the grants that you give. So, trends and implications. These are just 3 of the ones that, this is kind of my answer to your question earlier, Peter. What are the trends that I'm seeing? I'm certainly seeing a trend towards more collaboration. So, for example, issue-based networks or funder affinity groups. So these are groups of funders coming together formally or informally around a particular area of granting. Ian mentioned it. The Mental Health and Wellness Group is one example. Canadian Environmental Grant Makers is another example. And there are others now starting to spring up. We're a bit delayed in Canada, I would say, by reference to the United States, but it's coming very quickly, facilitated by digital. So what does that mean? That means more joint projects, I think, but also more challenges around communication and accountability. And it is a very big country still, physically, geographically. It's hard to overcome some of those time distances. So collaboration has its limits. Communication can be facilitated by digital, but it's not perfect. And it's hard to get people together. Trend facing up to digital. So that means open data. That means sharing platforms, more digital tools of all kinds. But the implication is that foundations have to be very thoughtful about their data strategies. And most foundations aren't. I think they think their data strategy is, well, we've got a website. Or actually, gee, we're being really bold. We've set up a Twitter account. You know, we're like cool here. We're tweeting. That's not a data strategy. What is a data strategy? It's something that foundations have to think very hard about. How are you collecting data? Are you making that data open? Is it machine readable? Is it something that you can share in an interface with others? Are you prepared to contribute to open data warehouses? And what does that mean? How will that work? Why aren't we doing more foundation grant mapping in Canada? Why don't we have what the Foundation Centre has been doing, which is mapping foundation activity in almost any area you can think of? We could do much more in this area. SDGs, mentioned earlier. We could be doing much more to collect information on how foundations in Canada are contributing to the SDGs and how they might be reporting data up and out in ways that can help us see a bigger picture around SDGs and you know, our commitment to the SDGs. So lots to do there. Communication with grantees as another important trend. I would say this whole question of two-way dialogue is becoming more and more important. So it's not just simply grant out and report in. It's much more a conversation, and I think Valerie alluded to this, but you know, much more exchange from the beginning of a project right through to the end. And that means going out and talking to people and having them come and talk to you and understanding what your goals are and what their goals are and what the linkages or the alignment is between those things. Right sizing as well, which means basically not imposing a one-size-fits-all reporting requirement or grant application requirement on any kind of charity, whether it's small or big. Because the capacity of charities to meet your requirements as a foundation can be very different. So a food bank and a university have very different levels of capacity to fill out a very complicated grant proposal. Right sizing is an important concept, I think, in the foundation community. But we do need more staff. I'm going to come back to that thought. You know, having enough staff, enough of the right staff, doing the right things is going to be critical for effect and impact. Some key questions, and these are the, how much more time have I got here? I've got less than 5 minutes, right?
You got more.
Yeah? Okay. I've only got 3 or 4 more slides just to reassure everybody. Key questions. Well, they're usually why, what, how kinds of questions, right? So again, these are not all the questions, but these are some important questions that I think Canadian foundations are beginning to ask themselves. So Ian's answered some of this. Valerie's answered some of this. Why be a strategic funder? Because I think there are opportunities to be a builder of resilience in communities. And I think the word resilience was used as well this morning. It is something that it's a difficult concept, but I think that it's something that a foundation can do uniquely. And I've answered the why with the what question just following that in this slide. Why? Because you want to build resilience, because you can support innovation, because you can identify and track impact. But what is it about a foundation that allows you to do that? So in what way is a foundation structured for purpose, for this purpose of being a strategic funder? Because most foundations are rooted in their communities and therefore know them, and they know the issues, or they could anyway. Potentially they could. They have a high tolerance for risk. I mean, who's electing you? Who's electing a foundation? Who's buying your stock? If you're a private foundation, you're not responsible either to voters or to shareholders. Arguably, you should have a higher tolerance for risk and a greater capacity to absorb failure. Because since journalists in Canada are not paying a whole lot of attention to foundations, voters aren't there, the public's not really asking a lot of questions, you could probably do a lot of very risky things and people wouldn't notice all that much. Why not do it then? You've got a long-term perspective. Most foundations are set up without limited life. In other words, I think the word perpetual is not a useful word. What's perpetual anyway? But foundations typically are set up to last longer in the private family foundation domain. They're set up to last a long time, probably beyond the lifetime of the donor, into another generation. Therefore, you have a longer horizon. You can think in multi-year terms. You don't have to make grants year by year by year. You can make them over a very long time horizon. And you can think about yourself as in terms of the role you're playing. Investor, donor, or operator. Some private foundations in Canada actually run their own programs and are not grantors. You don't have to actually, as a private foundation, make any grants at all. You can use all of your revenue for your own programs. Not very many do, but it is possible. And you can certainly think, you have the opportunity to think about these roles. So why not take full advantage of these unique assets of a foundation? How to measure impact. This is a how question. It's not the only how question. There are many other how questions. How do you do good grant making? How do you collaborate? How do you bring about policy change? How do you do impact investing? How do you measure impact? I've just picked how to measure impact because people are talking about it. And we didn't collaborate and have a conversation as Canadians about what we were going to talk about before we had these presentations, but other people mentioned measuring impact before I did here. So I do think it's an important set of issues. Michael might even talk about it too, in terms of measuring impact in a European context. And there are lots of issues around it. As a foundation, you've contributed, but can a change be attributed to you? How do you know that? How do you measure that? If you're assuming it's an attribution model, you're going to limit yourself in terms of what you're investing in, because not everything you do has direct causality. So, the cause and effect are not always clear, and in philanthropic and social change work, not at all clear. Individual or collective? Are you working individually as a grant maker, or are you working in a collective? Again, much harder to understand your individual impact if you are part of a collective. But that's not necessarily a problem. Then you want to understand the impact of the collective. So it's just a question to be thinking about. Timeframes. In the short term, you could be doing developmental assessments. How's it going? Do we need to be changing course? How do we understand our need for change? In the long term, you can do summative evaluations, or you can understand trends. And you can use it, finally, for learning. And I think learning being a key goal is crucial. I think measuring impact is not just because you want to write a good report at the end of the day. Reports are good, but learning from your experience as a foundation and using that learning to do better at what you're doing is absolutely critical. So I think I have a last slide, Peter. Moving ahead. So here again are a few challenges that have come up in our community, in the foundation community today in Canada. It's not comprehensive, there are others as well, but I do think as we look ahead that we will be thinking harder and talking to each other more about using both research and metrics to make more informed decisions. Goes along with data and our data strategies and how we use data. Conversely, it's not just stories, it's not just data, it's also stories. So I think that using and telling stories to demonstrate impact is going to be very important. We are encouraging it as a network. We don't just collect data on foundations as we've done here. It would be pretty boring actually if we only did this. I think it's very important to collect stories, and we'll be launching a new website very shortly called Philanthropy in Action, in which we are telling stories about the work of foundations, just as you heard them from Ian and from Valerie today. Partnering more effectively with communities and grantees. You've heard the word partnership now several times. I think partnership is a very difficult word in philanthropy. It's used. I'm not sure that it totally captures the differences in power and the imbalances in the relationships between foundations and grantees in particular, or foundations and community partners. Conversely, governments and foundations have the same kinds of issues. It's difficult to talk about partnering between government and foundations, again, because of the imbalance in resources and many of the differences in cultures. Nevertheless, the idea of working together, I think, is a very key idea. If philanthropy is going to have impact, it's going to have to be a collective impact, a coordinated impact, a partnered impact. So I just leave you with the idea of asking that question: what is the foundation's best value added? Goes back to Pin Jam. So if you walk out of here and you've only retained one thing from what I've said, credit Tim Broadhead, Pin Jam, repeat it to yourself. These are important things to think about. A foundation is much more than its money. A foundation is, I think, a very powerful instrument for change. It can be criticized, and I think it should be. I think we should hold ourselves accountable publicly more than we do. But I think that the future is very positive for foundation philanthropy in Canada. There are more people engaged in it, smart people asking questions, and I think having real impact. So it's actually an exciting time to be in Canadian philanthropy. Happy to answer any more questions that people might have. I think I'm now out of my time, Peter. Thank you very much. Give it a clicker back.
Just grab a seat. Staffing is always an issue. I mean, when I set up the Club B in the early 90s, it was more because every family office would have one person and they're running all this money, and it's just mind-boggling to do so. And also I see it on the philanthropic side. They hire one person. Yeah. You're going to run the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We've got time for some questions.
You made the comment that foundations can use their funds for their own use.
Yep.
Can you elaborate on that? I didn't put it in agenda.
So private foundations in Canada are allowed to use 100% of their revenues for their own programs. They don't have to be grant makers. These are distinctions that are established by the Canada Revenue Agency and by the Department of Finance. And you'll find the descriptions of the 3 different types of charitable organizations that we have in Canada. So that would be charities, as you would recognize them, public foundations, and private foundations. I would suggest that the differences between public foundations and charities on the whole it's difficult to see. The regulation of public foundations and charities tends to be very similar. The only difference between a public foundation and a charity on the whole is that a public foundation is required to be a grant maker. So it has to grant at least 51% of its revenues put those revenues out in the form of grants. A private foundation does not have to do that. So if you have a typical family foundation that's put $10 million away in an endowment, they've invested it, they're generating a return, so they're getting $200,000 a year, they can devote $200,000 if they want to running their own program with their own staff, and a typical budget that you would see for a program. You don't have to report that you've made grants. If you make grants, you have to make them only to what they call qualified donees. So that does limit, I was explaining this earlier, perhaps this is too much detail, but it is a major limitation on Canadian foundations, both public and private, that you can only give to qualified donees, because it means that you can't, as a foundation in Canada, you cannot give to a social enterprise. Social enterprise is not a qualified donee. So it limits the interactions that foundations can have with organizations if they're simply giving grants. Now, you can invest as a foundation in anything.
Let's take Gardiner Expressway, West Highway,
You're okay,
427,
401,
Express
you're
North
all right.
Toronto.
You've got a flight, I'm just checking ways.
That's nice of him, isn't it? Thank you. He's a full-service guy.
Hilary, I have another question for you. So, in recent years, we've seen, the emergence of, incredibly wealthy people and a kind of a skewing of the wealth in society. There are billionaires, and their wealth seems to be going up really fast. And so I'm interested in what's if we took maybe, let's say, the 20 wealthiest families in Canada, or maybe 30 wealthiest, what percentage of those really have a kind of a serious philanthropic program that is strategic and I guess as well, what do we need to do to get more of those really wealthy families to have the potential impact that they could have, which is presumably huge?
Tricky questions that I think about all the time, Ian. Clearly, the world I work in is one that is more focused on foundations as philanthropic vehicles than other types of giving. But I think I certainly don't want to discount or underplay the importance of giving as an individual. And we see many wealthy Canadians now giving multi-million-dollar gifts. And those are being celebrated. We're seeing full-page ads in the newspaper. For those boring old people like me who actually read newspapers, you do see these ads now. The universities and the hospitals tend to celebrate them the most. So there's a kind of celebration of individual giving that's going on now that I had not seen 10 years ago. And that's good. More families are giving larger amounts at the high end, in that small group of people at the very high end, in the 1% essentially in Canada. But is that strategic money? Is that the kind of money that could have a long-term impact? Again, I don't want to underplay those kinds of gifts. I do think that if you're going to put money into a foundation, as a family, I think you have tremendous opportunities, as you've proven, as your family has proven really well. So for me, the challenge is, how do you get more families to see that, to see the advantage of investing in a foundation, and then using that foundation to focus, to find an area of focus, and then to really make a difference in that area. So I think the other answer is storytelling. Again, communication around the potential and the opportunity of foundation philanthropy, which is why we're going to be putting a lot more effort on that as an organization, as a network, in the next couple of years. But we've been operating for about 15 years now as a network. We've grown every year. People come out to our conferences and they share with each other, as you know. They share stories with each other, and I think each year that's going to grow, that people are going to be inspired by the example of other families that have done some very interesting things. Again, I keep pointing to you, but you've shared your story, and I think it's a great example. And if I could get other families to do that, we might see a real upturn in this kind of strategic giving. One last thing, though. Next generation, you mentioned, Peter, or the millennials, or however you want to talk about them. I do see a kind of, it's a big concern in a way. I think millennials and next generation are generous, but they're not necessarily seeing foundations as being the place they want to put any money. So I don't want to be one of those who's, saying this buggy whip is really terrific when, you've got a car coming down the road that's going to be a whole lot more popular. Are young people going to say 10 years from now, foundations? Nah, not for me. That was my grandfather's generation. I've got much more interesting things to do. Equally philanthropic, equally oriented towards public benefit, equally interested in community change, but not necessarily through a foundation structure. So that's something that I think about. If you think about me staying awake at night wondering about things, that's a big question for me.
Another family, when I was coming back, said, Canada's interest, you either give money to the CRA or you give it away. You make your choice. So,
Or both.
So, yeah, both
Yeah.
it's getting both these days.
Yeah.
Look, I know you have a rush to the airport, so thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
I appreciate that. Thank
And
you.
we really appreciate your time coming out again, and hopefully we
My
can
pleasure.
do this again next year.
I hope so. Thank you very much. Thanks.